Question 1. What factors determine the appropriate environmental compliance strategy for salvage and mitigation operations following a major catastrophe, considering the need for prompt property restoration? Option A. The adjuster's personal familiarity with general environmental best practices, without specific verification of current regulations. Option B. The speed at which debris can be cleared from the property to allow for immediate reconstruction. Option C. The cost-effectiveness of available disposal sites, regardless of their regulatory approval status. Option D. The specific types of potential hazardous materials identified on site, the applicable federal, state, and local environmental regulations, and the requirements for proper disposal and documentation. Correct answer is D. The specific types of potential hazardous materials identified on site, the applicable federal, state, and local environmental regulations, and the requirements for proper disposal and documentation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because catastrophe adjusters must balance the urgent need for property mitigation and salvage with strict adherence to environmental regulations, which can be complex and vary by location. Failure to comply can lead to significant fines, project delays, and reputational damage, while overzealous or misinformed compliance can increase costs and hinder effective recovery efforts. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing demands. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the specific environmental regulations applicable to the disaster site, particularly concerning the handling and disposal of potentially hazardous materials that may be present in debris or damaged structures. This includes identifying regulated substances, understanding proper containment, transportation, and disposal protocols, and obtaining necessary permits or authorizations. Regulatory justification stems from the legal obligation to protect public health and the environment, as mandated by federal, state, and local environmental laws. Ethically, adjusters have a duty to act with due diligence and competence, which includes ensuring all actions taken during mitigation and salvage are legally compliant and environmentally responsible. An incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate debris removal without assessing for hazardous materials fails to acknowledge the potential for environmental contamination. This violates regulations designed to prevent the spread of pollutants and can lead to long-term environmental damage and legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach that involves disposing of debris in unapproved locations, even if seemingly convenient, directly contravenes waste management laws and environmental protection statutes, risking significant penalties and environmental harm. A third incorrect approach that relies on outdated or generic environmental guidelines without verifying current, site-specific regulations can lead to non-compliance due to changes in law or unique local requirements, demonstrating a lack of due diligence. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive site assessment to identify potential environmental hazards. This should be followed by consulting the most current and relevant environmental regulations for the specific jurisdiction. Engaging with environmental consultants or regulatory agencies when uncertainty exists is crucial. The adjuster must then develop a mitigation and salvage plan that integrates regulatory requirements into every step, from containment and removal to final disposal, ensuring all actions are documented and defensible. Question 2. Examination of the data shows a residential property experienced significant water intrusion from a burst pipe in the master bathroom. The water has spread to the adjacent hallway and master bedroom, affecting drywall, hardwood flooring, and various personal contents. Which approach best optimizes the assessment process for this water damage claim, ensuring compliance with regulatory expectations for a certified catastrophe adjuster? Option A. Focus primarily on the cost of replacing the burst pipe and immediate visible water damage, assuming the rest of the structure will dry out naturally without further intervention. Option B. Rely on the policyholder's verbal description of the damage extent and assume standard water damage protocols apply without a detailed site-specific assessment. Option C. Systematically document the source of the water intrusion, differentiate the water category e.g. clean, gray, black. Thoroughly inspect all affected areas including behind walls and under subflooring, assess the condition of all damaged contents, and consult with restoration professionals as needed to determine the full scope of necessary remediation and replacement. Option D. Conduct a visual inspection of the visible water stains on the drywall and measure the visibly affected flooring area. Then estimate replacement costs based on standard industry rates for these visible damages. The correct answer is D. Conduct a visual inspection of the visible water stains on the drywall and measure the visibly affected flooring area. Then estimate replacement costs based on standard industry rates for these visible damages. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because the adjuster must balance the policyholder's need for prompt and fair settlement with the insurer's obligation to pay only for covered damages, all while adhering to the specific regulatory framework governing catastrophe adjusters. The complexity arises from the dynamic nature of water damage, which can spread and worsen over time, and the need to accurately assess the extent of damage to various building components and contents, which can be subjective and require specialized knowledge. The adjuster must also navigate potential policy exclusions and limitations. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented assessment of the water intrusion source, the affected areas, and the materials damaged. This includes differentiating between clean, gray, and black water, and understanding the implications for remediation and replacement. It requires meticulous documentation of the damage, including photographic evidence, detailed notes on the condition of drywall, flooring, insulation, and contents, and consideration of the drying and restoration process. This approach aligns with the Certified Catastrophe Adjuster (CCA) exams focus on process optimization by ensuring a thorough, efficient, and defensible claim evaluation. Regulatory justification stems from the duty of good faith and fair dealing, requiring adjusters to act with diligence and competence, and to investigate claims thoroughly and impartially. Ethical considerations demand transparency with the policyholder regarding the assessment process and findings. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on visible surface damage without investigating the source or potential for hidden damage, e.g., behind walls or under flooring, fails to meet the duty of thorough investigation. This can lead to underpayment and dissatisfaction for the policyholder, and potential regulatory scrutiny for failing to adequately assess the loss. Another incorrect approach that relies on generalized assumptions about water damage without specific site assessment ignores the unique circumstances of each loss, potentially leading to inaccurate valuations and non-compliance with policy terms. This also violates the principle of individualized claim handling, an approach that prioritizes speed over accuracy, making quick decisions without proper documentation or expert consultation when needed, risks overlooking critical details, leading to errors in coverage determination and settlement, and failing to uphold professional standards and regulatory expectations for due diligence. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the policy provisions and relevant regulations. This is followed by a comprehensive site inspection, meticulous documentation, and an objective assessment of the damage based on evidence. When faced with complex issues, seeking expert advice, e.g., from restoration specialists, and consulting with the claims supervisor is crucial. The process should be iterative, allowing for adjustments as new information emerges, always prioritizing fairness, accuracy, and compliance. Question 3. When evaluating a claim for damage to a structure adjacent to the main house, which of the following approaches best reflects the adjuster's responsibility in interpreting the term dwelling as defined within the insurance policy? Option A. Apply a general industry standard for defining dwelling that is commonly used by other insurance companies, without specifically verifying its alignment with the policy in question. Option B. Strictly adhere to the explicit definition of dwelling provided in the policy's definitions section, applying it directly to the damaged structure based on its characteristics and intended use as described in the policy. Option C. Prioritize the policyholder's description of the structure and their belief that it should be considered a dwelling for coverage purposes, even if it deviates from the policy's formal definition. Option D. Rely on the common understanding of what constitutes a dwelling in everyday language, assuming it encompasses any structure where people might reside or spend time. The correct answer is B. Strictly adhere to the explicit definition of dwelling provided in the policy's definitions section, applying it directly to the damaged structure based on its characteristics and intended use as described in the policy. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a catastrophe adjuster to navigate the nuanced interpretation of policy language, specifically the definition of dwelling in the context of a complex property claim. Misinterpreting this definition can lead to significant underpayment or overpayment of claims, impacting both the policyholder's financial recovery and the insurer's financial stability, while also potentially violating regulatory obligations to handle claims fairly and accurately. The adjuster must balance the policyholder's expectation of coverage with the insurer's contractual obligations, as defined by the policy and applicable regulations. The correct approach involves meticulously examining the policy's definition section for dwelling and cross-referencing it with the specific facts of the loss. This approach is right because it adheres to the fundamental principle of insurance contract interpretation. The policy language itself is the primary source of coverage. Regulatory frameworks for adjusters, such as those governing fair claims handling practices, mandate that adjusters base their decisions on the terms and conditions of the insurance contract. By focusing on the policy's explicit definition, the adjuster ensures compliance with the contract and avoids making assumptions or applying external interpretations that are not supported by the policy document. This aligns with the ethical duty to act with integrity and competence, ensuring that claims are settled according to the agreed-upon terms. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the common understanding of a dwelling, without consulting the policy's definition, fails to uphold the contractual agreement. This is a regulatory failure because it deviates from the principle that insurance policies are contracts of adhesion, where the insurer's defined terms are binding. It also represents an ethical failure, as it potentially leads to an unfair settlement by either denying coverage that might be intended by the policy's specific wording or by providing coverage beyond what was contracted. Another incorrect approach that involves prioritizing the policyholder's verbal description of the damage structure over the policy's definition is also a regulatory and ethical failure. While empathy is crucial, an adjuster's authority and obligation are derived from the policy contract, not solely from the claimant's narrative. This approach risks overpaying claims based on subjective descriptions rather than objective policy terms, which can lead to financial mismanagement and potential regulatory scrutiny for improper claims handling. A further incorrect approach that involves applying a standard industry interpretation of dwelling without verifying it against the specific policy in question is a significant regulatory and ethical lapse. While industry standards can provide context, they do not supersede the explicit terms of an individual insurance contract. This can result in claim settlements that are either inconsistent with the policy's coverage or that fail to provide the full coverage intended by the policy's specific wording, thereby violating the duty of good faith and fair dealing. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a thorough review of the insurance policy, paying close attention to all defined terms relevant to the loss. The adjuster should then meticulously gather all factual information pertaining to the damaged property and compare these facts against the policy's definitions and coverage provisions. Any ambiguities should be resolved by referring to the policy's specific language and, if necessary, consulting with the insurer's underwriting or legal departments. The ultimate goal is to arrive at a claim settlement that is fully compliant with the policy contract and all applicable regulations, ensuring fairness to both the policyholder and the insurer. Question 4. Quality control measures reveal that an adjuster assessing damage to a pre-1980s wood frame residential structure following a moderate earthquake has primarily documented superficial plaster cracks and minor drywall damage. The adjuster has not consulted seismic building codes applicable to the era of construction or sought engineering input regarding potential shear wall or foundation integrity. Which of the following approaches best reflects the appropriate application of seismic building codes and engineering principles to this damage assessment? Option A. Immediately recommending a full upgrade of the structure to meet the most current seismic building codes, regardless of the extent of visible damage or policy provisions. Option B. Recommending repair solely based on the visible plaster and drywall damage, assuming the underlying structure is sound due to the building's age and typical construction methods of that era. Option C. Focusing only on cosmetic repairs and advising the policyholder that seismic structural integrity is typically excluded from standard property damage claims. Option D. Documenting all visible damage and, if structural concerns are indicated by the visible damage or the building's age and construction type, engaging a structural engineer to assess potential seismic-related structural weaknesses in accordance with relevant historical and current building codes. Correct answer is D. Documenting all visible damage, and if structural concerns are indicated by the visible damage or the building's age and construction type, engaging a structural engineer to assess potential seismic-related structural weaknesses in accordance with relevant historical and current building codes. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the adjuster to balance the immediate need for accurate damage assessment with the long-term implications of adhering to evolving seismic building codes and engineering principles. The adjuster must not only identify visible damage, but also infer potential structural weaknesses that may not be immediately apparent, especially in older structures not built to current seismic standards. This necessitates a nuanced understanding of how seismic forces impact different building materials and construction types, and how to apply engineering principles to assess the residual capacity of the damaged structure. The core challenge lies in distinguishing between superficial repairs and necessary structural remediation that aligns with current safety and building code expectations, without overinsuring or underinsuring the claim. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation that integrates visual inspection with an understanding of seismic engineering principles relevant to the building's age and construction. This means consulting relevant seismic building codes applicable at the time of construction and comparing them with current codes to understand the expected performance. The adjuster should engage with qualified structural engineers when complex structural issues are suspected, particularly concerning the building's ability to withstand future seismic events. This approach is justified by regulatory requirements that mandate fair and accurate claim settlements, ensuring that policyholders are indemnified for their losses in a manner that restores their property to a pre-loss condition, considering modern safety standards where applicable and legally permissible. Ethical considerations also demand that the adjuster act with due diligence and competence, avoiding assumptions and seeking expert advice when necessary to protect both the policyholder and the insurer. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on visible cosmetic damage and disregard the underlying structural integrity. This fails to meet the regulatory obligation to assess the full extent of the loss, including potential structural compromises that could render the building unsafe or susceptible to further damage in subsequent seismic events. Ethically, this approach is negligent and could lead to inadequate repairs, exposing the policyholder to future risks and potential financial hardship. Another incorrect approach is to automatically apply the most stringent, current seismic building codes to a structure built decades ago without considering the ordinance or law exclusion or the concept of building to code as it existed at the time of construction. While safety is paramount, insurers are generally obligated to cover losses based on the policy terms and the building's condition prior to the loss, not necessarily to upgrade the entire structure to current code standards unless specifically covered by an endorsement. This approach could lead to an inflated claim settlement that exceeds the actual loss incurred and may not be contractually supported, potentially leading to disputes and regulatory scrutiny. A third incorrect approach involves making assumptions about structural integrity based on the building's age or general appearance without any specific engineering evaluation. This lacks the necessary diligence and expertise required for a proper damage assessment, particularly in the context of seismic events where hidden damage can be significant. This can result in either an underestimation of the damage, leading to an unfair settlement, or an overestimation, leading to unnecessary costs. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation. First, understand the policy terms and conditions, including any relevant exclusions or endorsements related to building codes. Second, conduct a detailed visual inspection, documenting all visible damage. Third, if seismic damage is suspected, consult relevant historical building codes and engineering principles applicable to the building's construction type and age. Fourth, if the visible damage suggests potential structural compromise, or if the building's age and construction are such that seismic performance is a significant concern, engage a qualified structural engineer to assess the damage and provide recommendations. Finally, base the settlement on the findings of the investigation, expert reports, and policy provisions, ensuring fairness and compliance with all applicable regulations. Question 5. Benchmark analysis indicates that a recent severe thunderstorm event in a covered territory has been reported, with preliminary weather data suggesting hail of varying sizes. As a certified catastrophe adjuster, you are assigned to a property where the insured reports significant roof damage. Upon initial visual inspection from the ground, you observe some areas of apparent granule loss. Considering the potential for hail damage, which of the following approaches best aligns with the professional standards and regulatory framework for a certified catastrophe adjuster in assessing hail damage to the roof? Option A. Rely on the insured's report of significant damage and the visual observation of granule loss from the ground to estimate the extent of hail damage and recommend a full roof replacement. Option B. Focus only on areas with visible granule loss, assuming this is direct evidence of hail impact, and disregard other potential roofing issues or less obvious signs of damage. Option C. Conduct a detailed, systematic inspection of the entire roof surface, meticulously documenting evidence of granule loss, bruising and cracking, and correlating findings with the reported hail event's characteristics. Option D. Immediately conclude that the observed granule loss is solely due to hail and proceed with claim settlement based on standard industry repair costs for hail damage, without further detailed roof inspection. Correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed, systematic inspection of the entire roof surface, meticulously documenting evidence of granule loss, bruising and cracking, and correlating findings with the reported hail event's characteristics. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because accurately identifying hail damage requires a nuanced understanding of material science, weather patterns, and the specific limitations of different roofing materials. Adjusters must differentiate between pre-existing conditions, normal wear and tear, and damage directly attributable to a hail event, all while adhering to the policy's terms and conditions and relevant industry standards. The core challenge lies in objective assessment and documentation, ensuring that claims are paid fairly and accurately according to the policy and regulatory requirements. The correct approach involves a systematic and evidence-based assessment of the roof. This includes meticulously inspecting the entire roof surface for characteristic signs of hail impact, such as granule loss, bruising, where the asphalt mat is exposed but not punctured, and cracking. The adjuster must document the size, density, and pattern of the damage, correlating it with the reported hail event's characteristic size of hailstones, wind speed, trajectory. This methodical approach ensures that the assessment is objective, defensible, and aligns with the policy's coverage for direct physical loss caused by a covered peril, such as hail. Regulatory frameworks for adjusters emphasize thoroughness, accuracy, and adherence to policy provisions, making this detailed inspection and documentation the only professionally sound method. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on visual cues without a systematic inspection. For instance, assuming all granule loss is hail damage without verifying the pattern or extent of impact is a failure to conduct a proper investigation. This could lead to overpayment or underpayment of claims, violating the adjuster's duty of good faith and fair dealing, and potentially breaching regulatory requirements for accurate claim handling. Another incorrect approach is to attribute damage to hail without considering other potential causes, such as age, installation defects, or other weather events. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and can result in claims being improperly denied or paid, failing to meet the standard of care expected of a certified catastrophe adjuster. Furthermore, making a determination based on anecdotal evidence or industry hearsay rather than direct, documented observation would be a significant ethical and regulatory lapse. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a commitment to objective fact-finding. Adjusters should follow a structured process. First, understand the policy and the reported loss event. Second, conduct a comprehensive on-site inspection using appropriate tools and techniques. Third, document all findings meticulously with photographs, notes, and measurements. Fourth, analyze the evidence to determine causality and extent of damage. And finally, apply policy terms and conditions to reach a fair and accurate claim settlement. This systematic approach, grounded in evidence and regulatory compliance, is crucial for maintaining professional integrity and ensuring fair outcomes for all parties involved. Question 6. Regulatory review indicates that following a significant water intrusion event, a policyholder reports the presence of visible mold in several areas of their home. As a certified catastrophe adjuster, CCA, what is the most appropriate approach to determining the extent of mold growth and the necessary remediation requirements? Option A. Engage a certified mold assessment professional to conduct a thorough inspection, including air and surface sampling if necessary, and develop a detailed remediation plan based on their findings and applicable guidelines. Option B. Rely on the policyholder's description of the mold growth and their suggested remediation methods to determine the scope of work. Option C. Assume that any visible mold growth can be addressed through aggressive ventilation and the application of antimicrobial cleaning agents without further specialized assessment. Option D. Conduct a visual inspection to estimate the affected areas and recommend standard water damage drying and cleaning procedures. The correct answer is D. Conduct a visual inspection to estimate the affected areas and recommend standard water damage drying and cleaning procedures. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because determining the extent of mold growth and the appropriate remediation requirements involves a complex interplay of scientific assessment, regulatory compliance, and policy interpretation. Adjusters must balance the need to accurately assess damage and ensure the property is restored to its pre-loss condition, with the potential for significant remediation costs and the health implications of mold. Misjudging the extent or type of mold can lead to underpayment, disputes with the policyholder, or inadequate remediation, potentially causing further damage and health issues. The Certified Catastrophe Adjuster, CCA, designation implies a need for a thorough understanding of these nuances within the specified regulatory framework. The correct approach involves engaging a qualified mold assessment professional to conduct a thorough inspection and develop a remediation plan based on industry best practices and applicable regulations. This professional will use specialized equipment and techniques to identify the type and extent of mold, assess the impact on building materials, and determine the necessary containment, removal, and cleaning procedures. This aligns with the principle of acting in good faith and ensuring that the claim is settled fairly and accurately, reflecting the actual cost of restoring the property to its pre-loss condition, while also adhering to any specific state or federal guidelines concerning mold remediation that might be referenced in the policy or applicable statutes. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on visual inspection by the adjuster without specialized expertise. While adjusters are trained to assess damage, mold assessment requires specific knowledge and tools to detect hidden growth and accurately gauge its severity. This failure to engage a specialist could lead to an underestimation of the problem, resulting in insufficient coverage for remediation and potential health risks for occupants. Another incorrect approach is to assume that standard water damage restoration procedures are sufficient for mold remediation. Mold requires specific protocols for containment, removal, and disposal that differ from general water damage cleanup. Failing to follow these specialized procedures can lead to cross-contamination and incomplete remediation, violating the principle of restoring the property to its pre-loss condition and potentially contravening health and safety regulations. A third incorrect approach is to base remediation requirements solely on the initial visible mold growth without considering the potential for hidden contamination or the impact of the underlying moisture source. Mold can spread rapidly behind walls, under flooring, and within HVAC systems. Ignoring these possibilities and only addressing the surface-level issue will inevitably lead to recurring problems and inadequate claim settlement. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, identify the potential for mold based on the nature of the loss, e.g., water intrusion, high humidity. Second, if mold is suspected, engage a qualified third-party mold assessment professional to conduct a comprehensive evaluation. Third, review the assessment report and remediation plan, ensuring it aligns with industry standards and any applicable regulatory requirements. Fourth, work collaboratively with the policyholder and the remediation contractor to implement the approved plan, documenting all steps and costs. Finally, ensure the claim settlement reflects the agreed-upon remediation costs and any other covered damages. Question 7. The performance metrics show that following a significant seismic event, a multi-story commercial building exhibits widespread superficial cracking in interior walls and ceilings, along with some broken windows. However, the building's exterior appears largely intact, and there are no immediate signs of significant structural collapse or tilting. The adjuster must determine the most appropriate next step in assessing the earthquake damage. Option A. Advise the policyholder that the damage is minor and only cosmetic, and proceed with estimating the cost of repairing cracked plaster and replacing broken glass. Option B. Initiate a detailed structural investigation, including a review of the building's original design documents and potentially engaging a structural engineer to assess for hidden damage to load-bearing elements, foundations, and the overall seismic resilience of the structure. Option C. Assume that due to the building's age and construction type, the damage is consistent with typical seismic settlement, and proceed with a standard repair estimate for superficial damage. Option D. Recommend immediate occupancy based on the lack of visible structural collapse and focus on repairing only the superficial interior and exterior cosmetic damage. The correct answer is D. Recommend immediate occupancy based on the lack of visible structural collapse and focus on repairing only the superficial interior and exterior cosmetic damage. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the Certified Catastrophe Adjuster, CCA, to move beyond a superficial assessment of damage and delve into the underlying structural behavior during seismic events. The challenge lies in distinguishing between superficial cosmetic damage and critical structural compromise that may not be immediately apparent but significantly impacts the building's safety and future performance. Accurate assessment is crucial for fair claim settlement, adherence to policy terms, and ensuring public safety by preventing occupancy of unsafe structures. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of how different earthquake forces, such as ground acceleration, velocity, and displacement, interact with various building components and systems. This includes recognizing that different structural elements, foundations, walls, columns, beams, roofs, respond uniquely to seismic loads, and failure can propagate through the structure in complex ways. The adjuster must consider the building's design, materials, age, and any pre-existing conditions that might have exacerbated earthquake-induced damage. This aligns with the CCA's ethical obligation to conduct a diligent and competent investigation, accurately determining the cause and extent of loss as per industry best practices, and the implied duty of good faith and fair dealing inherent in insurance contracts. Regulatory frameworks for adjusters emphasize thoroughness and accuracy in damage assessment to prevent underpayment or overpayment of claims. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on visible damage, such as cracked plaster or broken windows. This fails to address the potential for deeper structural issues like foundation settlement, shear wall damage, or compromised load-bearing elements. Such an approach violates the adjuster's duty to investigate the full extent of the loss and could lead to an inadequate settlement, leaving the policyholder with unrepaired structural defects. This also risks misrepresenting the true condition of the property, which can have significant safety implications if the building is reoccupied without proper remediation. Another incorrect approach is to assume that all buildings of a similar age or construction type will experience the same type and severity of damage. Earthquakes are highly localized events, and the specific ground motion characteristics at a site, combined with the unique attributes of each building, lead to varied outcomes. Generalizing without specific investigation is a failure of due diligence and can result in inaccurate assessments. This overlooks the principle of individualized claim assessment, which is fundamental to fair insurance practices. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the owner's description of damage without independent verification and expert analysis. While the owner's input is valuable, it is not a substitute for the adjuster's professional expertise in evaluating structural integrity. This approach abdicates the adjuster's responsibility to conduct an objective and thorough investigation, potentially leading to claims being settled based on incomplete or biased information. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the building's response to seismic forces. This includes 1. Understanding the seismic hazard at the location, 2. Observing and documenting all visible damage, 3. Assessing the building's structural system and its potential vulnerabilities, 4. Considering the interaction of different structural components under seismic loading, 5. Consulting with structural engineers or other specialists when complex structural issues are suspected, and 6. Documenting all findings comprehensively to support the claim determination. Question 8. Market research demonstrates that accurate peril identification is paramount in catastrophe claims. A certified catastrophe adjuster, CCA, is presented with a claim involving significant roof damage, fallen trees, and debris scattered across a property. The adjuster has access to local weather reports indicating a severe thunderstorm passed through the area. Which approach to risk assessment is most appropriate for determining the specific type of wind damage? Option A. Focus solely on the extent of structural damage to the building and the cost of repairs, without in-depth analysis of the wind event's characteristics. Option B. Rely primarily on the insured's description of the event and the visual appearance of the damage, assuming it is consistent with a severe thunderstorm. Option C. Immediately classify the damage as straight-line wind damage, as this is the most common type of wind event associated with severe thunderstorms in the region. Option D. Conduct a detailed on-site inspection to analyze the pattern and directionality of the damage, correlate findings with meteorological data for the specific event, and consider the typical characteristics of straight-line winds, tornadoes, and hurricanes. The correct answer is D. Conduct a detailed on-site inspection to analyze the pattern and directionality of the damage, correlate findings with meteorological data for the specific event, and consider the typical characteristics of straight-line winds, tornadoes, and hurricanes. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because accurately identifying the type of wind damage is crucial for proper claim handling, policy interpretation, and subrogation potential. Misidentification can lead to incorrect coverage determinations, underpayment or overpayment of claims, and missed opportunities for recovery from responsible third parties. The adjuster must apply a systematic risk assessment approach, integrating knowledge of meteorological phenomena with policy language and regulatory requirements. The correct approach involves a detailed on-site inspection and analysis of the damage patterns, considering the geographic location and prevailing weather conditions. This includes looking for characteristic signs of different wind events, such as the rotational scarring and debris patterns indicative of a tornado, versus the more linear damage path of straight-line winds, or the widespread, often water-related damage associated with hurricanes. This methodical assessment aligns with the adjuster's ethical duty to conduct a thorough and impartial investigation, as mandated by industry standards and regulatory oversight bodies governing insurance claims handling. It ensures that the claim is processed according to the specific policy terms and conditions applicable to the identified peril. An incorrect approach would be to make a preliminary determination based solely on the insured statement without independent verification. This fails to meet the professional standard of due diligence and could lead to a premature and potentially erroneous conclusion, violating the duty to investigate thoroughly. Another incorrect approach is to assume the damage is consistent with the most common wind event in the region without considering specific evidence to the contrary. This demonstrates a lack of objective analysis and can result in misclassification of the peril, leading to improper claim settlement and potential regulatory noncompliance. Finally, focusing only on the visible structural damage without considering the broader environmental context and the specific characteristics of the wind event would be an incomplete risk assessment, failing to capture the full scope of the loss and its cause. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes evidence-based analysis. This involves 1. Gathering all available information, weather reports, insured statements, historical data. 2. Conducting a detailed physical inspection. 3. Documenting all findings meticulously. 4. Comparing observed damage patterns with known characteristics of different wind events. And 5. Applying policy provisions and regulatory guidelines to the established facts. This systematic process ensures an accurate and defensible claim determination. Question 9. Process analysis reveals that a catastrophe adjuster is assigned a claim following a severe storm that caused significant water intrusion into a coastal property. The insured has a homeowner's policy and a separate NFIP policy. The homeowner's policy excludes flood damage, and the insured believes the water intrusion is covered under their NFIP policy. The adjuster, while reviewing the NFIP policy, notes that the NFIP defines a flood as a general and temporary condition of partial or complete inundation of 2 or more acres of normally dry land area or of 2 or more properties from surface waters. The adjuster observes that the water intrusion appears localized to the insured's property and did not affect neighboring properties or a significant land area. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework of FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, for handling this claim? Option A. Recommend that the insured file a claim with their homeowner's insurance company, as storm-related water damage is typically covered under such policies, and defer any NFIP involvement. Option B. Advise the insured that the NFIP policy likely does not cover the damage because the observed water intrusion does not meet the NFIP definition of a flood, and therefore the claim should be processed under the homeowner's policy if any applicable peril is found there. Option C. Assume the NFIP policy covers the damage due to the presence of water intrusion, as this is a common cause of loss in coastal storm events, and proceed with adjusting the claim under the NFIP. Option D. Process the claim under the NFIP policy, but apply the standard homeowners insurance policy's definition of water damage to determine the extent of coverage and loss. The correct answer is B. Advise the insured that the NFIP policy likely does not cover the damage because the observed water intrusion does not meet the NFIP definition of a flood, and therefore the claim should be processed under the homeowner's policy if any applicable peril is found there. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a catastrophe adjuster to navigate the complex interplay between private insurance policies and the federal mandate of the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, administered by FEMA. The adjuster must understand the limitations and specific requirements of the NFIP, particularly concerning coverage exclusions and the definition of flood, to accurately assess and adjust claims. Failure to do so can lead to underpayment, disputes with policyholders, and potential regulatory scrutiny. The correct approach involves meticulously reviewing the insured property's flood elevation certificate and comparing it against the NFIP definition of a flood, as well as identifying any specific exclusions or limitations within the NFIP policy that might apply. This approach is right because it adheres strictly to the NFIP regulations, which are the governing framework for flood insurance claims in the United States. FEMA guidelines and the NFIP Standard Flood Insurance Policy, SFIP, explicitly define what constitutes a flood and what is covered. By focusing on these specific definitions and exclusions, the adjuster ensures compliance with federal law and the terms of the NFIP policy, thereby providing a fair and accurate settlement. An incorrect approach would be to assume that standard homeowners insurance policy definitions or general water damage principles apply to an NFIP claim. This is a regulatory failure because the NFIP is a distinct program with its own set of rules, separate from typical property insurance. Another incorrect approach would be to overlook the requirement for a flood elevation certificate or to misinterpret its findings in relation to NFIP coverage. This is an ethical and regulatory failure, as it demonstrates a lack of diligence in applying the program's core requirements, potentially leading to an inaccurate claim determination and a breach of professional duty to the policyholder and the program. A third incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the insured's description of the event without independently verifying the flood characteristics against NFIP criteria. This is a professional failure, as it bypasses the necessary due diligence required to confirm coverage under the NFIP, which mandates specific conditions for a flood event. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the specific regulatory environment governing the claim. This involves identifying the applicable program, NFIP in this case, thoroughly reviewing its regulations and policy documents, and applying those specific rules to the facts of the claim. Verification of key elements, such as the definition of the peril and the property's characteristics relative to program requirements, is paramount. Question 10. Research into the post-catastrophe assessment of a residential property reveals significant damage to the roof, interior water intrusion in multiple rooms, and extensive destruction of mature landscaping. The policyholder is concerned about the cost of replacing the damaged trees and shrubs, as well as the structural integrity of the home. Which of the following assessment methodologies best aligns with regulatory requirements for fair and accurate claims handling for a certified catastrophe adjuster, CCA? Option A. Focus primarily on the structural damage to the home, as this represents the largest potential loss, and provide a minimal estimate for landscaping damage, assuming it is a less critical component of the claim. Option B. Rely on the policyholder's verbal description of the damage to landscaping and personal property, and issue a settlement based on their perceived losses without a detailed on-site inspection or independent cost verification. Option C. Conduct a visual inspection, estimate the cost of replacing all damaged landscaping based on a general understanding of nursery prices, and provide a lump sum estimate for structural repairs without detailed line-item breakdowns. Option D. Systematically document all visible damage to the structure and personal property, differentiate between covered damage and pre-existing conditions, or wear and tear. Utilize industry-standard estimating software to develop detailed repair and replacement cost estimates for covered items, and clearly identify any policy limitations or exclusions applicable to landscaping. Correct answer is C. Conduct a visual inspection. Estimate the cost of replacing all damaged landscaping based on a general understanding of nursery prices, and provide a lump sum estimate for structural repairs without detailed line-item breakdowns. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because accurately assessing damage to structures, landscaping, and personal property after a catastrophe requires a nuanced understanding of policy terms, local building codes, and the physical realities of disaster impact. Adjusters must balance the policyholder's expectation of full restoration with the insurer's obligation to indemnify only for covered losses, while also adhering to strict regulatory requirements for claims handling. The potential for subjective interpretation of damage severity and the need for objective documentation make this a critical area for regulatory compliance. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented inspection process that differentiates between covered damage and pre-existing conditions, or wear and tear, utilizing industry-standard estimating software and adhering to the specific policy language. This approach is justified by regulatory frameworks that mandate fair and prompt claims handling, accurate damage assessment, and proper documentation to support claim payments. For example, regulations often require adjusters to act in good faith, investigate claims thoroughly, and provide clear explanations of coverage. An incorrect approach that relies solely on visual estimation without detailed documentation or consideration of policy exclusions fails to meet regulatory standards for thoroughness and accuracy. This can lead to underpayment or overpayment of claims, both of which can result in regulatory penalties and damage to the insurer's reputation. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over accuracy, by not properly accounting for all damaged items, or by making assumptions about repair costs without proper investigation, violates the duty to investigate and the principle of indemnification. This can also lead to disputes with policyholders and potential legal action. A further incorrect approach that ignores specific policy endorsements or limitations related to certain types of property or damage, such as landscaping or specific personal property items, directly contravenes the contractual obligations outlined in the insurance policy and the regulatory requirement to adjust claims according to policy terms. Professional decision-making in similar situations requires a structured process. First, thoroughly review the policy to understand coverage, exclusions, and endorsements. Second, conduct a detailed on-site inspection, meticulously documenting all observed damage with photographs, measurements, and notes. Third, utilize appropriate estimating tools and resources to quantify the loss. Fourth, compare findings against policy terms and applicable regulations. And fifth, communicate findings and settlement offers clearly and transparently to the policyholder. Question 11. To address the challenge of accurately assessing earthquake damage claims under a standard homeowner's policy, a certified catastrophe adjuster, CCA, receives a claim following a significant seismic event. The policyholder reports extensive structural damage and damage to personal property. The adjuster's initial review of the policy declarations page indicates a standard homeowner's policy is in effect, but it does not explicitly list earthquake as a covered peril. However, the adjuster recalls that earthquake coverage is often an endorsement. What is the most appropriate and regulatory compliant course of action for the adjuster to take in determining coverage for this claim? Option A. Thoroughly review the policy jacket and all attached endorsements to determine if an earthquake endorsement is present and to ascertain its specific terms, conditions, deductibles, and exclusions. Option B. Advise the policyholder that earthquakes are generally excluded from homeowners' policies and suggest they explore separate earthquake insurance options without confirming the existence of any specific endorsement on their current policy. Option C. Assume that standard homeowners' policy language does not cover earthquake damage and inform the policyholder that the claim is likely not covered without further investigation. Option D. Rely on general industry knowledge regarding earthquake coverage limitations to estimate potential payouts, regardless of the specific policy details. The correct answer is A. Thoroughly review the policy jacket and all attached endorsements to determine if an earthquake endorsement is present and to ascertain its specific terms, conditions, deductibles, and exclusions. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the adjuster to navigate the nuanced interplay between a standard homeowner's policy and a specific earthquake endorsement, while also adhering to strict policy limitations and regulatory disclosure requirements. The adjuster must not only understand the technical aspects of earthquake coverage, but also ensure that the policyholder is fully informed about what is and is not covered, preventing potential disputes and upholding ethical standards. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the specific earthquake endorsement attached to the homeowner's policy. This endorsement will detail the scope of coverage, including any deductibles, coverage limits for different types of damage, e.g., structural, personal property, and specific exclusions. The adjuster must then meticulously compare the reported damages to the terms and conditions outlined in this endorsement. This aligns with the regulatory framework for adjusters, which mandates accurate claims handling, adherence to policy provisions, and transparent communication with the insured. By focusing on the specific endorsement, the adjuster ensures that their assessment is grounded in the contractual agreement and applicable regulations, preventing misrepresentation of coverage. An incorrect approach would be to assume that standard homeowners policy language automatically covers earthquake damage without verifying the presence and specific terms of an earthquake endorsement. This fails to acknowledge that earthquake coverage is typically an add-on and has its own distinct limitations and exclusions. Such an assumption could lead to an underpayment or denial of a valid claim, violating the policy contract and potentially incurring regulatory penalties for unfair claims practices. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on general industry knowledge about earthquake damage without consulting the specific policy and endorsement. While general knowledge is helpful, each policy is a unique contract. Failing to reference the exact policy terms means the adjuster is not acting on the agreed-upon coverage, which is a fundamental breach of their duty. This can lead to disputes and damage the reputation of the insurance industry. A third incorrect approach would be to communicate to the policyholder that earthquakes are generally not covered, without first confirming the existence and specific terms of any earthquake endorsement. This is a premature and potentially misleading statement. The adjuster's duty is to investigate and report based on the specific policy in force, not to make broad generalizations that could discourage a policyholder from pursuing a valid claim. This lack of specific investigation and communication is a failure in professional duty and regulatory compliance. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a comprehensive review of the policy documents, paying close attention to any endorsements or riders that modify standard coverage. The adjuster must then meticulously document their findings, cross-referencing damages with the precise language of the policy and endorsements. Transparent and accurate communication with the policyholder throughout the claims process is paramount, ensuring they understand the coverage and limitations as defined by their specific contract. Question 12. Analysis of a claim for a damaged antique armchair, where the policyholder insists on receiving the full cost of a brand-new, custom-made replica, arguing that the original armchair held significant sentimental value and was irreplaceable. The adjuster has determined the replacement cost of a comparable new armchair to be $5,000, and based on the armchair's age and condition, has calculated its actual cash value, ACV, to be $1,500 after applying depreciation. The policy clearly states coverage is based on actual cash value, which approach best upholds the principles of indemnity and the policy's terms. Option A. Pay the policyholder $5,000 as the policyholder considers the item irreplaceable and the cost to create a replica is known. Option B. Offer to pay $3,000, a compromise between the policyholder's perceived value and the adjuster's calculation, to expedite the claim. Option C. Pay the policyholder $1,500, explaining that this represents the actual cash value of the armchair at the time of the loss, which is the policy's limit for this type of claim. Option D. Advise the policyholder that due to the sentimental value, the claim is uninsurable and no payment can be made. The correct answer is C. Pay the policyholder $1,500, explaining that this represents the actual cash value of the armchair at the time of the loss, which is the policy's limit for this type of claim. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in catastrophe adjusting, determining the appropriate payout for a damaged personal property item when the policyholder's understanding of indemnity and actual cash value, ACV, differs from the insurer's contractual obligations. The professional challenge lies in balancing the insurer's duty to indemnify the insured against their loss with the contractual limits of the policy, specifically the ACV provision. This requires a nuanced understanding of policy language and regulatory expectations, ensuring fairness while adhering to the terms of coverage. The correct approach involves accurately calculating the ACV of the damaged item. This means determining the replacement cost of a similar new item, and then applying depreciation for age, wear and tear, and obsolescence. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the definition of ACV as typically stipulated in insurance policies and regulatory guidance for catastrophe adjusters. The Certified Catastrophe Adjuster (CCA) designation implies adherence to a framework that prioritizes fair and accurate claims settlement based on policy terms and applicable regulations, which mandate indemnification based on the actual value of the property at the time of loss, not its replacement cost without depreciation. An incorrect approach would be to pay the full replacement cost of a new, similar item without any deduction for depreciation. This fails to adhere to the ACV provision of the policy. Ethically and regulatorily, this overpayment would constitute a breach of the insurer's contractual obligations and potentially violate regulations governing claims settlement, as it exceeds the actual loss sustained by the insured. Another incorrect approach would be to offer a settlement based solely on the insured's perceived value or sentimental attachment to the item, without considering its market value or replacement cost. This is incorrect because insurance policies are contracts of indemnity based on objective value, not subjective sentiment. Such an approach would be arbitrary, inconsistent with policy terms, and could lead to disputes and regulatory scrutiny for unfair claims practices. A further incorrect approach would be to offer a settlement significantly below the depreciated replacement cost, arguing that the item was old and therefore worth very little, without a proper basis for the depreciation calculation. This is incorrect as it fails to indemnify the insured for their actual loss. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence in assessing the item's condition and market value, potentially leading to an unfair settlement and violating regulatory requirements for claims handling. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Thoroughly reviewing the policy to understand the coverage for personal property and the definition of ACV. 2. Investigating the damaged item to determine its age, condition, and the cost to replace it with a similar new item. 3. Applying a reasonable and justifiable depreciation based on the item's age, wear and tear, and obsolescence, adhering to industry standards and any specific regulatory guidelines for depreciation. 4. Clearly communicating the ACV calculation and the basis for depreciation to the policyholder, explaining how the settlement amount was determined in accordance with the policy terms. 5. Being prepared to negotiate within the bounds of the ACV calculation, always prioritizing fairness and adherence to the policy and regulations. Question 13. The investigation demonstrates that a property experienced a severe weather event. The adjuster is tasked with determining if the observed damage to the roofing materials is solely attributable to hail, or if it is a result of wind-driven debris, pre-existing wear, or a manufacturing defect. Which investigative approach best aligns with the principles of accurate claims handling and regulatory compliance for a certified catastrophe adjuster? Option A. Concluding that all circular indentations on the roof are hail damage without investigating the possibility of wind-blown objects or other causes. Option B. Dismissing the possibility of hail damage because the roofing material is generally considered durable without conducting a specific analysis of the observed damage patterns. Option C. Accepting the policyholder's statement that hail caused all visible damage and proceeding with estimating repairs based on that assumption. Option D. Examining the physical characteristics of each impact mark, comparing them to known hailstone sizes and impact patterns, correlating findings with official meteorological reports for the event's date and location, and assessing the material's known susceptibility to hail, while also actively looking for evidence of other damage types. The correct answer is D. Examining the physical characteristics of each impact mark, comparing them to known hailstone sizes and impact patterns, correlating findings with official meteorological reports for the event's date and location, and assessing the material's known susceptibility to hail, while also actively looking for evidence of other damage types. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because accurately differentiating hail damage from other forms of damage, such as wind-driven debris or manufacturing defects, requires meticulous observation, a thorough understanding of material science, and strict adherence to established claims handling protocols. Misidentification can lead to significant financial implications for both the policyholder and the insurer, and can erode trust in the claims process. The adjuster must navigate potential biases, the subjective nature of visual inspection, and the need for objective evidence to support their findings, all while operating within the defined regulatory framework for claims adjusting. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic, evidence-based methodology that prioritizes objective indicators of hail impact. This includes examining the physical characteristics of the damage, e.g., shape, depth, presence of spalling or bruising, correlating these with meteorological data for the date and time of the loss, and considering the material's susceptibility to hail. This approach is justified by the regulatory requirement for adjusters to conduct a thorough and impartial investigation, supported by credible evidence, to determine the cause and extent of loss. Adherence to industry best practices and the specific guidelines of the Certified Catastrophe Adjuster (CCA) program, which emphasize accurate damage assessment and documentation, further validates this method. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that relies solely on the policyholder's assertion of hail damage without independent verification fails to meet the adjuster's duty of due diligence and impartiality. This can lead to improper claim payments and violates the principle of acting in good faith. An approach that attributes all visible surface imperfections to hail, without considering alternative causes like wind-driven debris, pre-existing conditions, or manufacturing defects, demonstrates a lack of investigative rigor. This can result in overpayment of claims and a failure to identify non-covered losses, contravening the adjuster's obligation to accurately assess the loss. An approach that dismisses potential hail damage based on a general assumption that the material is not susceptible, without specific investigation into the material's properties and the nature of the observed damage, is an oversimplification. This can lead to underpayment of valid claims and a failure to uphold the insurer's contractual obligations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive review of the policy's terms and conditions. This is followed by a detailed on-site inspection, meticulously documenting all observed damage, its characteristics, and potential causes. Crucially, this involves cross-referencing findings with reliable meteorological data and, when necessary, consulting with material experts or utilizing specialized testing methods. The adjuster must maintain objectivity throughout the process, ensuring that conclusions are based on verifiable evidence rather than assumptions or subjective interpretations. Documentation should be thorough and precise, providing a clear audit trail for the claim's assessment and resolution. Question 14. During the evaluation of property damaged by inundation following a significant weather event, what is the most critical factor in distinguishing between freshwater flood damage and saltwater inundation from storm surge for accurate claim adjustment? Option A. Relying on the homeowner's description of the event's duration. Option B. Assessing the speed at which the water receded from the property. Option C. Estimating the depth of the water based on visible water lines on structures. Option D. Analyzing the type and composition of debris deposited on the property and the presence of saline indicators. The correct answer is D. Analyzing the type and composition of debris deposited on the property and the presence of saline indicators. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because accurately identifying the source and type of flood damage is critical for proper claim adjustment, policy interpretation, and regulatory compliance. Misclassifying flood damage can lead to incorrect coverage determinations, underpayments, overpayments, and potential regulatory scrutiny. The Certified Catastrophe Adjuster (CCA) designation implies a commitment to upholding industry standards and regulatory frameworks, necessitating a precise understanding of flood types and their implications. The correct approach involves meticulously documenting observable evidence to differentiate between freshwater flooding, saltwater intrusion, and storm surge effects. This includes noting the presence of debris salinity levels, if testable or indicated by vegetation/corrosion, sediment composition, and the pattern of water inundation relative to tidal influences or storm track. This detailed observation directly supports the accurate application of policy provisions and adherence to regulatory guidelines governing flood claims, ensuring fair and equitable claim handling. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the visible waterline, without considering the source or associated debris, fails to meet the professional standard. This oversight can lead to mischaracterizing storm surge as simple freshwater flooding, potentially ignoring specific policy exclusions or endorsements related to coastal events. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes the speed of assessment over thorough documentation risks overlooking crucial evidence that distinguishes between different flood types, leading to inaccurate coverage assessments and potential noncompliance with claims handling regulations. Finally, an approach that relies on assumptions about the flood source without direct evidence is a significant ethical and professional failing, as it deviates from the principle of objective claim investigation and can result in unfair claim outcomes. Professionals should employ a systematic, evidence-based decision-making process. This involves 1. Initial site inspection to gather all observable evidence, including watermarks, debris, sediment, and any signs of saltwater impact. 2. Consulting available data such as weather reports, tidal charts, and storm surge models to corroborate observed evidence. 3. Applying policy language and relevant regulatory requirements to the documented evidence to determine coverage. 4. Clearly documenting all findings and the rationale for the coverage determination. Question 15. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a policyholder's claim for water damage resulting from a burst pipe in an unoccupied dwelling may be subject to specific coverage limitations. The Certified Catastrophe Adjuster, CCA, is tasked with explaining the claim decision and any applicable coverage limitations to the policyholder. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines for the Certified Catastrophe Adjuster, CCA, exam, focusing on clear communication and adherence to policy terms? Option A. Explain that the policy's coverage for water damage is comprehensive and the unoccupied status is a minor detail that will not significantly impact the claim payout. Option B. State that the policy does not cover damage to unoccupied dwellings, regardless of the cause of the damage, and offer a goodwill gesture for a portion of the repair costs. Option C. Advise the policyholder that all water damage is generally covered under their policy, and any limitations due to the dwelling's occupancy status will be addressed later if necessary, without specifying the exact limitation at this time. Option D. Inform the policyholder that while the pipe burst is covered, the unoccupied status of the dwelling may limit coverage for resulting water damage due to policy exclusions for vacant properties, and provide a copy of the relevant exclusion clause from the policy. The correct answer is D. Inform the policyholder that while the pipe burst is covered, the unoccupied status of the dwelling may limit coverage for resulting water damage due to policy exclusions for vacant properties, and provide a copy of the relevant exclusion clause from the policy. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the Certified Catastrophe Adjuster, CCA, to balance the insured's expectation of full coverage with the precise limitations outlined in the policy, all while adhering strictly to the regulatory framework governing insurance claims in the specified jurisdiction. The adjuster must not only identify the relevant policy provisions, but also communicate them clearly and ethically to the policyholder, avoiding any misrepresentation or misleading statements. The core challenge lies in translating complex policy language and regulatory requirements into an understandable explanation for a distressed policyholder. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the policy's specific language regarding the type of damage sustained, cross-referencing it with applicable state statutes and departmental regulations that dictate claim handling practices, particularly concerning coverage limitations and the explanation of benefits. This approach prioritizes transparency and accuracy. The adjuster must then articulate the coverage decision, clearly explaining what is covered, what is not covered, and precisely why, citing the specific policy language and any relevant regulatory guidance that supports the decision. This ensures compliance with regulations that mandate clear and timely communication of claim decisions and the basis for any denials or limitations. Ethical considerations also demand that the adjuster act in good faith, providing a fair and honest assessment of the claim. An incorrect approach would be to provide a vague or generalized explanation of coverage limitations without referencing specific policy language or applicable regulations. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for clear and understandable communication and can lead to accusations of bad faith or misrepresentation. Another incorrect approach is to imply coverage that is not explicitly stated in the policy, or to downplay the significance of exclusion clauses. This violates the duty of good faith and fair dealing, and can expose the insurer to regulatory penalties and legal action. Furthermore, failing to provide the insured with a clear understanding of why certain aspects of their claim are not covered, or not providing the basis for the decision, directly contravenes regulations that require adjusters to explain claim decisions and coverage limitations comprehensively. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a meticulous review of the policy contract and all relevant endorsements. This is followed by an examination of applicable state insurance laws and regulations governing claim handling and policy interpretation. The adjuster must then objectively assess the loss against these documented provisions. The communication of the decision must be clear, concise, and directly address the insured's claim, providing specific reasons for coverage or denial/limitation, supported by policy language and regulatory references. This systematic process ensures both regulatory compliance and ethical treatment of the policyholder. Question 16. The efficiency study reveals that a catastrophe claims team is experiencing significant delays in initial claim assessment and payment issuance following a major hurricane event. To optimize the process and ensure timely assistance to policyholders while maintaining regulatory compliance, which of the following strategies would best align with catastrophe claim handling best practices? Option A. Implement a tiered assessment strategy that prioritizes claims based on severity and potential for immediate need, allowing for faster initial payments on less complex claims, while more complex ones undergo deeper investigation. Option B. Solely rely on external adjusters for all claim handling, without establishing standardized internal oversight or reporting procedures. Option C. Delay all claim payments until a complete and exhaustive investigation is concluded for every single claim, regardless of complexity. Option D. Issue blanket, advance payments to all affected policyholders, without any initial assessment or verification of basic coverage. Correct answer is A. Implement a tiered assessment strategy that prioritizes claims based on severity and potential for immediate need, allowing for faster initial payments on less complex claims, while more complex ones undergo deeper investigation. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals that a catastrophe claims team is experiencing significant delays in initial claim assessment and payment issuance following a major hurricane event. This scenario is professionally challenging because it directly impacts policyholders who are already in a state of distress and financial vulnerability. The core challenge lies in balancing the need for thorough investigation and accurate claim valuation with the urgent requirement to provide timely financial relief to those affected by the catastrophe. Failure to do so can lead to reputational damage for the insurer, regulatory scrutiny, and most importantly, prolonged hardship for the insured. Careful judgment is required to implement process improvements that are both effective and compliant with all applicable regulations. The correct approach involves implementing a tiered assessment strategy. This strategy prioritizes claims based on severity and potential for immediate need, allowing for faster initial payments on less complex claims, while more complex ones undergo deeper investigation. This approach is justified by regulatory frameworks that mandate prompt claim handling and fair settlement. For instance, regulations often require insurers to acknowledge claims promptly, provide necessary claim forms, and commence investigation within a reasonable timeframe. By segmenting claims and expediting simpler ones, the team adheres to the spirit and letter of these regulations, demonstrating a commitment to prompt service and financial assistance. This also aligns with ethical obligations to act in good faith and with due diligence. An incorrect approach would be to delay all claim payments until a complete and exhaustive investigation is concluded for every single claim, regardless of complexity. This fails to acknowledge the urgency of the situation and the potential for immediate financial needs of policyholders. Such a delay could violate regulations requiring prompt payment of undisputed portions of a claim and could be construed as acting in bad faith, as it prioritizes internal process completion over the policyholder's immediate welfare. Another incorrect approach is to issue blanket advance payments without any initial assessment or verification of basic coverage. While seemingly proactive, this can lead to overpayments, disputes, and potential fraud, ultimately undermining the integrity of the claims process and potentially leading to financial instability for the insurer. This approach disregards the fundamental requirement for a reasonable investigation to determine the extent of the insurer's liability. A third incorrect approach is to solely rely on external adjusters without adequate internal oversight or standardized procedures for their deployment and reporting. This can lead to inconsistencies in claim handling, potential for errors, and a lack of control over the overall efficiency and compliance of the claims process, potentially violating the insurer's responsibility to manage its claims operations effectively and in accordance with regulatory standards. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape governing claim handling, including prompt payment statutes and unfair claims settlement practices. It requires a proactive assessment of potential bottlenecks in the current process and the development of strategies that prioritize both efficiency and compliance. This involves engaging with the claims team to understand their challenges, exploring technological solutions for faster data processing, and establishing clear protocols for claim triage and escalation. The ultimate goal is to create a system that is responsive to policyholder needs while upholding the insurer's fiduciary duties and regulatory obligations. Question 17. Comparative studies suggest that when determining the cost of temporary repairs and mitigation measures following a covered catastrophe, a catastrophe adjuster's primary responsibility is to balance the immediate need for property protection with the insurer's obligation to pay for reasonable and necessary expenses. Which of the following approaches best aligns with this principle and regulatory expectations? Option A. Focusing solely on the cost of permanent repairs and deferring any discussion or approval of temporary measures until the full scope of permanent repairs is definitively established. Option B. Approving the most readily available and comprehensive temporary repair solution, regardless of cost, to expedite the stabilization process and minimize potential disputes. Option C. Prioritizing the least expensive effective method to stabilize the property and prevent further damage, ensuring all costs are directly related to the immediate mitigation needs and are documented with supporting estimates. Option D. Recommending that the insured undertake all temporary repairs themselves and seek reimbursement only after permanent repairs are completed, provided the costs are deemed reasonable at that later stage. The correct answer is C. Prioritizing the least expensive effective method to stabilize the property and prevent further damage, ensuring all costs are directly related to the immediate mitigation needs and are documented with supporting estimates. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a catastrophe adjuster to balance the immediate need to protect insured property from further damage with the insurer's obligation to pay only for reasonable and necessary expenses. The adjuster must exercise sound judgment to ensure that temporary repairs and mitigation measures are both effective and cost-efficient, adhering strictly to the policy's terms and conditions and relevant regulatory guidelines. The core tension lies in preventing escalation of damage versus avoiding unnecessary expenditures that could be construed as overpayment or outside the scope of coverage. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the damage and the specific needs for mitigation. This includes evaluating the urgency of the repairs, the potential for further damage if mitigation is not undertaken, and the reasonableness of the costs associated with the proposed temporary measures. The adjuster must ensure that the chosen methods are the least expensive effective means to achieve the necessary protection, aligning with the principle of indemnity. This approach is ethically and regulatorily sound, as it upholds the insured's right to have their property protected from further loss, while respecting the insurer's financial responsibilities and the policy's limitations. Adherence to the policy's language regarding temporary repairs and mitigation, and any applicable state insurance department regulations on fair claims handling, is paramount. An incorrect approach would be to approve the most expensive temporary repair option without adequate justification, simply because it is the quickest or most convenient. This fails to meet the standard of reasonableness and could violate regulations requiring claims to be settled for no less than the actual loss sustained, but also no more. Another incorrect approach is to deny all temporary repairs, even when clearly necessary to prevent further damage, citing a strict interpretation of permanent repair clauses. This could lead to increased overall claim costs and violate the duty to act in good faith and fair dealing, potentially breaching regulatory requirements for prompt and equitable claim handling. Approving repairs that are not directly related to mitigating the immediate catastrophe-related damage, such as cosmetic enhancements, would also be an ethical and regulatory failure, as it deviates from the principle of indemnity and the purpose of temporary repairs. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a systematic evaluation of the situation. This involves 1. Understanding the policy provisions related to temporary repairs and mitigation. 2. Conducting a detailed inspection to assess the extent of damage and the immediate risks. 3. Researching and obtaining quotes for various cost-effective mitigation options. 4. Documenting the rationale for selecting a particular approach, including why it is the most reasonable and necessary. 5. Communicating clearly with the insured about the approved measures and their purpose. 6. Ensuring all actions comply with applicable state insurance laws and regulations governing claims handling. Question 18. The evaluation methodology shows a systematic approach to assessing flood damage, prioritizing the identification of the flood's ingress points, the vertical extent of inundation, and the specific impact on various building components and systems. Which of the following best describes the most appropriate and professionally sound methodology for a certified catastrophe adjuster, CCA? In this scenario, adhering to regulatory frameworks and ethical obligations. Option A. Rely on the policyholder's description of the flood's impact and adjust the claim based on their provided information without extensive on-site verification. Option B. Focus primarily on the immediate visible damage to finished surfaces like flooring and drywall, assuming that underlying structural components are unaffected unless clearly compromised. Option C. Document the waterline. Meticulously inspect all affected areas for saturation and material degradation, assess structural integrity, and consider potential secondary damage such as mold, while differentiating flood damage from pre-existing conditions. Option D. Conduct a rapid visual inspection focusing on obvious surface damage and estimate repair costs based on general knowledge of flood losses. The correct answer is D. Conduct a rapid visual inspection focusing on obvious surface damage and estimate repair costs based on general knowledge of flood losses. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because evaluating flood damage requires a nuanced understanding of how water interacts with building materials and systems, and how to differentiate between flood-induced damage and pre-existing conditions or damage from other causes. The Certified Catastrophe Adjuster, CCA, must apply a systematic and defensible methodology that aligns with industry best practices and regulatory expectations for accurate and fair claims handling. The core challenge lies in the dynamic nature of floodwaters, which can cause widespread, often insidious, damage that is not immediately apparent. The correct approach involves a detailed, systematic inspection that prioritizes identifying the flood's point of entry, the extent of water inundation, and the specific materials and systems affected. This includes documenting the waterline, assessing structural integrity, evaluating the condition of insulation, drywall, flooring, and mechanical/electrical systems, and considering the potential for mold and mildew growth. This methodical process ensures that all aspects of flood damage are considered, leading to a comprehensive and accurate assessment that is crucial for fair claims settlement. This aligns with the ethical obligation of adjusters to conduct thorough investigations and the regulatory requirement to handle claims in a timely and equitable manner, ensuring policyholders receive the benefits to which they are entitled under their policy. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on visible surface damage fails to account for the saturation and potential degradation of hidden structural components, such as subflooring, wall studs, and insulation. This oversight can lead to underpayment of claims, leaving policyholders with inadequate funds for proper repairs, and potentially exposing them to long-term structural issues and health hazards like mold. This violates the ethical duty to conduct a complete investigation and the regulatory imperative to ensure fair claim resolution. Another incorrect approach that relies heavily on assumptions or generalized damage estimates without site-specific inspection is also professionally unacceptable. This bypasses the fundamental requirement for an adjuster to gather evidence and make informed judgments based on the actual conditions at the loss site. Such an approach is prone to significant errors, potentially leading to both underpayment and overpayment of claims, and undermines the credibility of the claims process. It fails to meet the standard of care expected of a licensed adjuster and can result in regulatory scrutiny and penalties. A professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a commitment to thoroughness, objectivity, and adherence to established claims handling protocols. Adjusters must prioritize understanding the policy provisions, meticulously documenting all findings with clear notes and photographic evidence, and applying their technical knowledge to interpret the impact of the flood event on the property. When faced with complex damage, consulting with specialists or engineers may be necessary to ensure the accuracy of the assessment. The ultimate goal is to provide a fair and accurate evaluation that reflects the true extent of the covered loss. Question 19. Investigation of a residential property loss following a wildfire reveals significant smoke damage to the interior, ember-caused damage to the exterior landscaping, and contamination from fire retardant used by firefighters. The insured expects full coverage for all resulting damages. What is the most appropriate approach for the adjuster to determine coverage? Option A. Include the cost of removing fire retardant as part of the standard debris removal coverage, as it is a direct consequence of the firefighting efforts. Option B. Assume all damages directly resulting from the wildfire event are covered, as the property was directly impacted by the fire. Option C. Thoroughly review the insured's policy, including all endorsements and exclusions related to wildfires, smoke, and fire suppression activities, to determine the extent of covered damages and applicable limitations. Option D. Deny coverage for smoke damage, as it is often considered a secondary effect of the fire and not a direct loss. The correct answer is C. Thoroughly review the insured's policy, including all endorsements and exclusions related to wildfires, smoke, and fire suppression activities, to determine the extent of covered damages and applicable limitations. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because wildfire insurance policies often contain complex endorsements, exclusions, and limitations that can significantly impact coverage for damage caused by embers, smoke, and fire suppression efforts. Adjusters must navigate these nuances while adhering to the specific regulatory framework governing catastrophe adjusters in the designated jurisdiction. A thorough understanding of the policy's language, coupled with an objective assessment of the damage and its direct cause, is paramount. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the insured's policy, paying close attention to any wildfire-specific endorsements, debris removal clauses, and limitations on coverage for indirect damage or damage resulting from fire suppression activities. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the adjuster's duty to accurately interpret and apply the terms of the insurance contract, as mandated by regulatory bodies overseeing insurance claims. It ensures that coverage decisions are based on the agreed-upon terms between the insurer and the insured, preventing both underpayment and overpayment of claims. Adherence to the policy's specific language and the applicable regulatory guidelines is the cornerstone of ethical and lawful claims handling. An incorrect approach would be to assume coverage for all wildfire-related damage without a detailed policy review. This fails to acknowledge the contractual limitations and exclusions that are a standard part of many wildfire policies, potentially leading to a breach of contract and regulatory violations for failing to apply policy terms correctly. Another incorrect approach would be to deny coverage solely based on the presence of smoke damage, without investigating whether the smoke originated from a covered peril, and if the policy provides any coverage for smoke damage. Even if limited, this overlooks the potential for coverage under specific policy provisions or endorsements that may address smoke damage as a consequence of a covered fire. A third incorrect approach would be to automatically include the cost of removing fire suppression materials, like retardant, as part of the debris removal coverage without verifying if the policy specifically addresses such costs or if they are excluded. Many policies have specific limitations or exclusions for damage or costs associated with fire suppression efforts, and assuming coverage without verification is a deviation from proper claims handling. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the policy contract, followed by a detailed investigation of the loss, and then a careful application of the policy terms to the facts of the loss. This process must be guided by the specific regulations of the jurisdiction, ensuring all actions are compliant, ethical, and in the best interest of both the insured and the insurer. Question 20. The evaluation methodology shows that a property is located within a designated Special Flood Hazard Area, SFHA, on the most current FEMA flood zone map. The adjuster has also obtained a valid elevation certificate for the structure. Which of the following approaches best reflects the required regulatory framework for assessing flood risk and determining appropriate coverage under the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP? Option A. Use the elevation certificate to compare the lowest adjacent grade to the base flood elevation, BFE, and cross-reference this with the flood zone designation to accurately assess the structural flood risk. Option B. Utilize an older version of the flood zone map that was previously used for a neighboring property to assess the risk, as flood patterns are unlikely to have changed significantly. Option C. Assume the flood risk is high and adjust coverage based on the visual appearance of the property and its proximity to a nearby creek, without consulting the elevation certificate or the most current flood map. Option D. Rely solely on the flood zone designation from the map to determine the flood risk and coverage, as the property is clearly in a high-risk area. Correct answer is D. Rely solely on the flood zone designation from the map to determine the flood risk and coverage, as the property is clearly in a high-risk area. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the Certified Catastrophe Adjuster, CCA, to interpret and apply complex regulatory information, flood zone maps and elevation certificates, to a real-world claim scenario, directly impacting the policyholder's coverage and the insurer's financial exposure. The adjuster must demonstrate a thorough understanding of the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, guidelines, which are the bedrock of flood insurance in the United States, and how these guidelines translate into practical risk assessment. The core challenge lies in accurately determining the flood risk based on official data, rather than assumptions or anecdotal evidence. The correct approach involves meticulously cross-referencing the property's elevation certificate with the current FEMA flood zone maps for the specific location. This process ensures that the assessed flood risk is based on authoritative, up-to-date data, as mandated by NFIP regulations. The elevation certificate provides the precise ground elevation of the structure, while the flood zone map designates the expected flood hazard level for that area. By comparing these two pieces of information, the adjuster can accurately determine if the building's lowest floor is above, at, or below the base flood elevation, BFE. This adherence to official data is not only a regulatory requirement, but also an ethical imperative to ensure fair and accurate claims handling. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the visual appearance of the property or its proximity to known water bodies is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for established regulatory frameworks. NFIP regulations explicitly require the use of official flood maps and elevation data for risk assessment and rating. Relying on visual cues or general knowledge of the area bypasses these critical regulatory requirements, leading to potentially inaccurate risk assessments and incorrect coverage determinations. This can result in undercharging premiums, leaving the insurer exposed to greater risk, or overcharging, unfairly burdening the policyholder. Another incorrect approach would be to use outdated flood zone maps. FEMA regularly updates its flood maps to reflect changes in hydrology, topography, and development. Using an outdated map means the risk assessment is based on inaccurate information, potentially misclassifying the property's flood hazard. This violates the regulatory requirement to use the most current available data for flood risk assessment. Finally, an approach that ignores the elevation certificate and only considers the flood zone designation is also flawed. While the flood zone provides a general hazard level, the elevation certificate is crucial for determining the specific risk to the structure. A property in a high-risk flood zone might have a lower risk if its lowest floor is significantly above the BFE, as indicated by the elevation certificate. Conversely, a property in a moderate risk zone could face a higher risk if its lowest floor is below the BFE. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with identifying the governing regulatory framework, in this case, NFIP. Then, the adjuster must identify the specific data points required by that framework, flood zone maps, elevation certificates. The next step is to obtain the most current and accurate versions of this data. Finally, the adjuster must apply the data according to the established methodology, cross-referencing and interpreting the information to arrive at an accurate risk assessment. This systematic approach ensures compliance, fairness, and professional integrity.